placed from the lake, though place still defines them, they're still identified as lake trout. This, paired with the nostalgic lament of the first sentence, complicates the romanticization of the past, reminding us that the unbalance uncovered in the lake trout imagery transfers to relationships to humans, between humans, and among humans, too, which the poem doesn't avoid. My body is long, which is to say, not without its history, but not quite free. The moral autobus brings Black activist and one of Martin Luther King's contemporaries, Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat to a white passenger on a public bus to mind, reinforcing for us that something, here, an autobus, that might seem outside of the moral universe, is in fact inside it because of the social practices and policies enacted in and on it. I can't help but hear the homophone arc, A-R-K, in the lines, just the arc of my spine, which could be anyone, speaking to self-preservation and calling for recognition of a shared humanity at stake in the poem. By the poem's end, which sees the speaker doing someone else's calculus, which shows the speaker doing the math, an idiom that revolves around putting two and two together or coming to an understanding of how things work, threats to justice are enacted on the body of the word, dissolving the singular justice into two words, just is, speaking to ideologies that are naturalized and treated as just the way things are. The poem formally suggests that we must call attention to and reckon with the patterning of our thoughts, ideas we've internalized, and calls for a larger questioning of what just is. I want to move from Petrosino's lineated formal poem to a prose poem from a sequence in Claire Wamenholm's Wilder, published in 2018. Poems in the sequence, scattered throughout the second section of the book, take as their starting place a letter in the alphabet and evoke alphabet books, primers for learning the English language, each beginning, respectively, B is for, G is for, D is for, W is for. B. B is for brown bear, for berries and beehives, buds and blossoms, a babbling brook. Brown bear lumbering through the balsam firs toward the baton and bludgeon. See brown bear bedeviled as it basks on a sunny boulder, baited as it browses for clover. B is for barbed wire, for how brown bear can't bathe in the water because of beasts beneath the waves. Blinded by the baleful white bark of birches, by the bald face of the blank moon, brown bear doesn't hear branch buckle and break. B is for bearing witness. See brown bear be clouded, be starred, benighted by hunters, even in the boundless sky. See the polar bear's blanket of blubber, its blithe beatitude. B is for bang, bang, for ballistics and barricades, for backbones breaking, for breathing or not. B for blood and the badge and bullet. B as in behave, beware, as in bereft. B is for baby, and for the way some baby bears grow up into big bears, and some never do. B is for barren and the burning din, for how bulletins are bursting with the bodies of brown bears and the alphabet is just beginning. The opening sentence of B echoes Inger Christensen's alphabet, translated to English from the Danish by Susanna Need, whose second section consists of 2 lines. Bracken exists, and blackberries, bromine exists, and hydrogen. Like Christensen's alphabet, Wallman Holmes Wilder is preoccupied with ecological devastation and how humans affect the world and each other. Brown Bear's bacchanal gets disrupted in the second sentence as its lumbering journey takes it toward the baton and bludgeon, both of which read as dangerous or threatening when put side by side, recalling the brutality of law enforcement and tools of submission, rightly bedeviling Brown Bear, whose carefree basking and clover browsing have rendered it oblivious to its hunters, who have already laid bait Brown Bear has yet to recognize. The introduction of barbed wire in the third sentence, coupled with Brown Bear's inability to bathe in the water, brings to the poem histories of boundary making, marking who space is for and is not for, recasting the poem's representational language. The language of is for flips from stands for to is for in the sense of is on behalf of or to the benefit of. Language of possession, rights, prioritization, and privatization. We might do well to be reminded barbed wire is a 19th century invention of U.S. settler colonialism, an invention that coincided with Lincoln's Homestead Act of 1862, which gave each citizen the right to claim 160 acres of public land. The superfluous use of barbed wire disrupted the law of open range, limiting access to land and water, alluded to here. In the poem, it's the beast beneath the waves that deter Brown Bear's bathing, and the habitat continues to interfere with, rather than bolster, thriving, as we see Brown Bear's efforts thwarted from not only below, but from ground level and above, as it's blinded by bark of birches, by the bald face of the blank moon. In a poem that traffics in weaponry, the modifier blank in blank moon renders the moon an empty cartridge that fails to transmit the needed signal to Brown Bear, who we learn, in the midst of its disorientation, doesn't hear the branch buckle and break. And here, as we perhaps expect in a sonnet, more so than in a prose poem, the poem turns. B is for bearing witness. The shift from noun to verb, from bear to bearing, mirrors Brown Bear's transmutation from a terrestrial being to a celestial one. Here, it's worth noting the mythic origins of Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, the bear constellations themselves. They are figures banished to the night sky to protect them from becoming vengeance's fodder, to protect them from death. The poem complicates a placid notion of death as transcendence, stressing to us that even in the boundless sky, Brown Bear is benighted by hunters, calling to mind the constellation Orion and the attendant myth of the hunter's damning bravado, the claim he could kill all Earth's animals, which led to him being moored in the sky. The poem suggests our existence, B as B, B-E, or being, is for bearing witness, summoning us to pay attention to what is happening around us and to give testimony. See, 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 say, say, say. In see, S-E-E, or seeing, we might also hear the homophone C for the letter C, what follows alphabetically B, and plays on the idea that from being follows seeing and signals a shift from the ontological to the epistemological and questions regarding perception. And move back to the poem here. Given that the polar bear has by now become a primary symbol of climate change, perhaps of interest here is that the polar bear is not emaciated, but instead warmed by its blanket of blubber, blessed with indifference. After the introduction of polar imagery, the poem breaks, bringing in conceptual polarities that govern daily experiences. The phrase B is for bang, bang suggests not only the reality of gun violence in the US, but also the way gunplay has been normalized for children. Bang, bang being the sound one makes when shooting finger guns. From there, we quickly move from child's play to a lexicon of policing and militarization, ballistics and barricades, set up as a natural progression from which follows backbones breaking and the question of whether one is breathing or not. A question that, for contemporary American readers, will inescapably bring up issues of police brutality and the especial vulnerability of Black citizens, Black being one of the unspoken B's of the poem, especially in light of the following lines: B for the blood and badge and bullet, and the admonishment, behave, beware, encouraging self-policing under the threat of consequences. The possibility of bereavement, of being deprived of one's loved ones, is a reality the poem cannot and does not avoid. The next line hinges on a rewriting of Hamlet's oft-quoted soliloquy, to be or not to be. But unlike for Hamlet, choice is not at the center of his conundrum. This conundrum. B is for baby, and for the ways some baby bears grow up into big bears, and some never do. The inability to thrive may be a matter of choice, circumstance, or nature, as suggested by barrenness, or something more nefarious or tragic, as suggested by the burning den, which raises the question of the source of fire or devastation. The poem's final line asks us to consider what is being recorded, deaths or sightings, and the bursting, a sense that the bound is on the brink of becoming unbound, seems to literalize the idiom, too much to bear. The alphabet, here a metonym for language more broadly, might not be able to hold the whole of experience, or inadequate language to mitigate despair or disaster might arrive too late. But there's also a bet inside alphabet, a wager. In the face of unpredictability, there's still the hope of not only new beginnings, but also just ones. The alphabet is just beginning. The final poem I want to share with you is Some Kind of We, which is the opening poem in Ari Banias's Anybody, published in 2016. The philosophical bent of Anybody often manifests in an exploration of self and other, relational dynamics, and issues of inclusion and exclusion, For many readers, the title Anybody will likely recall the following Emily Dickinson poem. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They'd advertise, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog, to tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring fog. How public might well be the exclamation at the center of Benias's poems, sometimes cast as praise and other times as lament, as the poems prod many binaries, including public, private, and attempt to reconcile themselves with the fact that the self is neither singular nor wholly one's own. As Benias writes, it is this year in this country, and I am this person with this set of meanings on my body. Here's the poem in its entirety. Some kind of we. These church bells bong out one to another in easy conversation that wants to say, things are okay, but things, they are not okay. And I can't trust a church bell, though I would like to, the way I can trust that in this country, in houses, apartments, there somewhere is a cabinet or drawer where it's stashed. The large plastic bag with slightly smaller mashed together plastic bags inside. It is overflowing, and we keep adding, bringing home more than we need. We should have to weave a three-piece suit of plastic bags, a rug, a quilt, a bed of bags even. Anything more useful than this collection, this excess. Why am I writing about plastic bags? Because it is this year in this country, and I am this person with this set of meanings on my body. And the majority of what I have, I mean what I literally have the most of in my apartment, more than plants, more than forks and spoons and knives combined, or chairs, or jars, or pens, or socks, is plastic bags. And I am trying to write, generally and specifically, through what I see and what I know about my life, about our lives. If in all this there can still be tarnished, problematic, and certainly uneven, a we. As you may have noticed as I was reading and as you were following along, there's significant tension between the line and the sentence, further emphasized by the poem's resistance to the period, the punctuation of conclusion or completion, stressing the ongoingness of crisis. Things, they are not okay. While a semicolon enters in line 14 of this 30-line poem, signaling the end of the first clause in the complex compound sentence, a period does not enter until the end of the last line, punctuating the speaker's desire to know if in all this there can still be tarnished, problematic, and certainly uneven, a we. The italicized we that serves as the poem's last word and the elongation that is an effect of the emphasis of the italics themselves draw out the we, W-E-E, in we, W-E, emphasizing the relative smallness of the human we, despite the broadness of our impact, for which the superfluous plastic bags of the poem serve as a metonym, speaking to the interrelationships among consumerism, industrial waste, pollution, climate change, and the limits, if not failures, of the interventionist strategies of reuse and recycle. The final phrase, a we, may at first read as oxymoronic in a poem that is skeptical about gathering and collecting, but the qualifiers, tarnished, problematic, and certainly uneven, along with the indefinite article a, suggest this we is just one possible manifestation among many, and position this singular collective as imperfect and provisional, calling to mind strategic essentialism, prioritizing sameness temporarily in order to mobilize around shared interests, call to action, and effect change. Still, this speaker is unsure of what can be shared and the limits of understanding, illustrated in the parenthetical question that finds the speaker wondering if an investigation of self is also an investigation of others, if one's own experience creates a lens or a wall. I am trying to write through what I see and what I know about my life, about our lives. What is ours? Of course, there are other readings available to us too. We as the self's proliferation, a reminder we live through a series of eyes. After listening to and thinking about the three pieces I shared today, I hope you get a sense of the different strategies and forms contemporary American poets are using as they strive to discover insights into issues of being and belonging and being with. While their strategies may differ, contemporary American poets have made a renewed turn or have made renewed commitments to the political in their poems, highlighting the self as social. And in the case of Petrosino's political poem and Benias's Some Kind of We, using the poem's I as a maypole around which to wrap and weave social critique. I hope you'll find yourself reading and writing poems throughout the month and beyond, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I thank you again for inviting me today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kristi. It was awesome. It's captivates me. So well, this and your presentation is very engaging and thought provoking. So well, I think these three poems you've recited and discussed are not just interesting but also deep, especially in terms of the relation they share. Uh, can we argue that these three talk about the notion of power or power relation from three different thematic perspectives, Dr. Christie?
I definitely think so. I think when we're thinking about Kiki Petrosino's work, and she's always so deeply invested in the racial history of the U.S. from
Mm-hmm.
a Black perspective, coming at the writing as a Black writer, a Black woman writer. So she's thinking about not only whiteness and Blackness, but also about the gendered body. So that's always part of the what's being worked through in the space of the poem. The Woman Home, I think, is an interesting poem because of using the avatar of Brown Bear to work through all of the issues of ecology. So distancing the human really in some ways, or decentering the
Mm.
human from that conversation in ways that
Okay.
feel really important. And for Ari Benias, who is a writer who is a trans writer and also the child of Greek immigrants, there are all kinds of competing narratives about nation building, about what it means to to not only be kind of an American, but what it means to be a human, what it means to be located in a body. So I think you're absolutely
Uh, and then about the political poems by Petrosinos, she actually it's the what is that? The thing that interests me much is how she play the word justice with just is, and also the deployment of the word art, universe, justice, moral to illuminate her political disposition and also the emotion. Could you please elaborate that one a bit for us?
sure. I mean, I think what that poem in a lot of ways is getting at is that kind of that tension between kind of the goal one is working toward and the wall one keeps hitting up against in working toward that goal, which is why I
Mm-hmm.
think that form is particularly relevant to that poem because the line, um, the kind of the idealism of the line does sit at the end, but then it gets all mixed up and distorted. So it something about the way it's deployed by us
Mm-hmm.
disallows it from maintaining its idealistic integrity. And we see this as the poem keeps hitting up against the wall of that line, which
Mm-hmm.
I think is a really interesting aspect of the two forms that are happening simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. So, but do those relate also with Petrosina's background as African, Italian American descent?
Oh, I mean, I would say definitely. The other poem that she used that she employs the telistic strategy,
Mm-hmm.
that line at the end. The other sequence where she does that, she's actually using a really racist line from Thomas Jefferson's writings.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Thomas Jefferson, is an American figure that is held quite in esteem, and to discover in his writings the kind of racist underbelly of them kind of recast some of the relationship that the poet as a native Virginian has to Jefferson. So it's a really conflicted relationship of understanding some of the things in his writing that are worth celebrating, and then other things that are just um, that need to be reckoned with, the racist aspects of them
Mm-hmm.
that have to inform some the thoughts that are put forward in the more supportable writing too. So in that poem, interestingly, she italicizes the
Mm-hmm.
end line. So
Mm-hmm.
it really creates uh, a disconnect between the unitalicized horizontal line
Mm-hmm.
and the italicized vertical line. But I feel like even the moral autobus and the bringing in of all kinds of civil rights activism through King and Parks, I think, and even that one line, that great in there's a great kind of sneaky getting in of the kind of American histories of literacy, which are really important to Petrosina's work, when she writes, um, I can't read the stars. When she says that part, that I can't read, um, both both I can't know what's ahead. I can't read the stars. I can't astrologize, right? But I can't read as its own phrase is really profound when we think about the ways that enslaved people brought from Africa into the United States were kept from literacy because to be able to read and articulate, to be able to um, find one's power and voice and change
Mm-hmm.
one's positioning. So that's a
Oh.
really significant moment in the poem.
Mm. So justice is just is then.
Mhm.
All right. Okay, let's move on a bit to Claire Woman Holmes. Am I pronounce it correctly? So unlike Petrosino's poems, these poems centers on a wordplay which starts with the alphabet B, right? And then, but then the noun phrase, a babbling brook, seems to me to represent the poem's content and as well as the poet's style. Is it correct?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Oh, okay. The noun phrase, okay, the poems used, a babbling brook, seems to represent the poem's content as well as the poet's style. Is it correct?
Do you Could you elaborate on what you mean? Like just because
Be,
it's the
because of what?
are you talking about the sound babbling brook?
Yes, the sound and also the content. It's like like someone when trying to babble, and then and it's just and B is for this. B is for this. B is for bang bang, for ballistic, for barricades, for backbones. Da 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 da. But then it's not just about that one. It's deep. It's just deep and yeah, it's all about the if I may say it's written in partition form. I mean of a narrative. But then do you think do I read that one correctly or what?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely. I think that's a great reading of Babbling Brook. That opening kind of image creates kind of this geyser that spouts out the poem. It's almost like the poem is birthed from that sound of Babbling Brook.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think it's a poem that's definitely because of the focus on the letter B. I think poems that orient themselves around one letter tend to
Mm-hmm.
be really sound dense because they're collecting that sound, right? And so therefore they're amplifying that
Mm-hmm.
sound. So there's both kind of the sonic level of that, but also that great homophonic B E, the that that that's always engaging the nature of being simultaneously um, among all these sounds and experiences. So it really, but narrative is a very common feature of the prose poem. It's often, um, sometimes a prose poem can be kind of cast generically as flash fiction. So it's like,
Mm-hmm.
is this flash fiction or is this a
Mm-hmm.
prose poem?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and really, it just depends
On
on
how we read it, we'll see it.
exactly, exactly.
And then the some kind of we by Ari Banyas, Banyas or Banyas, I don't know. Uh,
Anaya?
this one, some kind of we attempts to portray, I believe, not the plastic bag in literal sense, but then more to how the speaker depicts the alternative kind of we and also the humanity. Does this have to do with the background of the poet himself?
I can't um, speak to that authoritatively, but
Mm,
definitely I sense that um, the urgency with which the poet is seeking an answer to the question of the possibility of a we definitely relates to feelings of alienation that I
mm,
think we can all identify with in a world um, that only allows sometimes for certain kinds of connections. And I think maybe especially a lot of us are feeling this poem's relevance now in 2021, where our ability to be with is rendered more difficult than it even
mm.
had been perhaps before.
Okay, okay. Oh, one more question for me. It's what puzzles me when reading this. I mean, the some kinds of we is the three-piece suit of plastic bags. Why three? Why do they? Why? How do they relate with the alternative kind of we?
I think the three-piece suit kind of goes with this image of
Mm-hmm.
kind of kind of exorbitant wealth or the corporate businessman, the type
Mm.
of person who would have on a three-piece suit.
Okay.
and I think because of the poem's interest in like capitalism, that idea of complicity that we all might as well be wearing a three-piece suit. Don't displace um, kind of the problems of capitalism onto the corporate players, but
Mhm.
wear that suit yourself as well, perhaps. I mean, that's just one possible way to engage that.
Yeah, 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 yeah. You're right. Okay, and we are all plastics, according to
Exactly.
Yes. Well,
Hmm.
thank you so much, Dr. Christie, for the insight. So we're going to move on to the Q&A session. So, ladies and gentlemen, and my dear students, uh, we will have the Q&A session. Some questions have been posed here from, let me check, from Nadia, if I'm not mistaken. Hang on. From, yes, Nurmadia Fatah. She asked two questions. Um, the first one is whether in U.S. poetry, whether whether the U.S. poetry can be a non-medical medium mental healer. And then the second one, I also want to know: are young people in U.S. currently enthusiastic about poetry, at least participating in poetry writing contests, and becoming the literary tradition there is loved there?
Yeah, I definitely think that a lot of people come to poetry initially because it is cathartic to express yourself. So I think there's definitely still a very vibrant writing tradition in the United States of writing toward healing, of writing, um, of kind of writing to close a wound. So I definitely think that's part of it. And even when you're seeing the Gorman poem that was referenced at the beginning of this session in the icebreaker, and you think about how the presentation of that poem at the inauguration um, and the celebration of that poem um, and kind of this, it was a great kind of national moment for poetry because it kind of reminded us that we can connect and collectively heal through sharing our experiences through language. So definitely poetry and healing, poetry and catharsis are definitely alive and kicking in the United States. It's oftentimes, I think, people's entry into it. The other question, can you remind me what the other question was?
The second one is about are young people in United States currently enthusiastic about poetry, at least participating in poetry writing contests and becoming the literary tradition that is loved there.
Oh, yes, yes. I would say poetry always has its writers and readers. I think it's um, I get the sense that a lot of people are writing it. I know that when our school hosts open mics, it seems like the majority of people who sign on to those open mics are coming to read a poem. So I think that's a really good sign for me. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Christy. So I'm going to invite Mbak Suci Launi to ask directly to Dr. Kristi Maxwell. Mbak Suci or Ibu Suci, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Okay, so can I open? Wait for me. Okay, so I have a question. Thank you so much for Ibu Nadia for the opportunity, and to Mrs. Maxwell for showing us some great, really great poetry that I did not know before. And it's such a nice to meet you here, Miss. And actually, I just wonder what's the topic of poetry that you like or interest, and uh, and I can you show us what's your favorite of your own works as a poet? Thank you so much.
What a great question. I think that the kinds of things that I'm writing about most and thinking about most, and kind of reading around. So the kind of work I'm gravitating toward is writing that's thinking about issues of climate change. I've been working on a series of poems that are lipograms, which is writing that excludes one or more letters, um, and starting with the name of an endangered animal, for instance, and then any of the letters in that endangered animal's or species name can't appear in the poem itself. So it creates quite an interesting problem the poem has to solve, because even when we think of the animal cheetah, that disallows for the use of an A or an E or a C or an H. So you can't even say a word as kind of fundamental as the, THE, the article the. Um, so that's kind of what I'm doing and what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about poems that are seeking to address or think about issues of climate change. Um, I don't know necessarily how I can show you my work right now, but I can tell you that I'm really excited about my most recent book, My, which does think about these issues of the human animal in the world, and what it. So yeah, so my might be a place to go to see some of my newest work.
Okay. Why climate change? But let's just what is that? We're going to postpone on that one. But I'm going to move on to Aisyah Syahrini from Universitas Negeri Jakarta. She said that her question is kind of outside the material, but I'm just curious. In Indonesia, we know that there is a poetry musicalization where the poetry is sung rather than just read. Is that also is that also a thing, or this thing also applies in America as well? If that's a yes, could you please share a little bit about it? Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think some of our most, again, kind of lively poetry um, is probably in rap and hip hop. So I guess that's where it's being sung or put to music
Mhm.
most readily in contemporary U.S. Um, poetry. So yeah, so I think that's where that tradition is kind of at for us right now.
Okay, all right. In song then, and then there is another question from Aksopyananda. Good evening. I want to ask about the viability of delivering such as story through poems. If it is possible, then what's the best way to go about it?
About history and poems.
Uh, the viability of delivering as story through poems. I'm not so sure about this one.
Mhm.
What
Um,
do you think, Aksobananda? Oh,
well, definitely, there's a long a tradition of narrative poetry. Think of epic poetry,
okay.
the kind of stories that are conveyed through those long sequences. So I think definitely you can tell a story through poetry. And perhaps one of the benefits of telling a story through a poem versus telling a story in kind of prose, long form, is the compactness of the poem, that it can really kind of create a node of feelings around the experience being conveyed. So it's allowed through its diction and syntax and images to almost create a counter narrative to the narrative that's being presented. And I think its density is one of the things that allows it to do that. And it's obviously too just its 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 connection with phrasing and musicality and those kinds of aspects always kind of create kind of two tiers to that
Mhm.
narrative, where the lyric and the narrative are always intersecting, or at least hovering in this way that creates a nice tension in a poem.
Mhm. Okay, so we can actually read the poems as a story. And then we're going to move on to Fatima Azahra from UIN, from State Islamic University, Sarif Hidayatullah, Jakarta. Her question is, what do you think if we read a poem, if but we didn't get the meaning or intent that delivered by the poet? Can we interpret it according to our own thinking? Our own, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most wonderful things about poetry is that it can't be it can't be limited to one interpretation. Um, Once it's out in the world, the writer of the poem has very little say on on how the poem is experienced. It becomes ours. It becomes something we get to absorb and think through and um, collaboratively make meaning for, using the tools the poet's given us, using kind of the breadcrumbs the poet's given us to engage in experience of the poem. So I often think reading poetry or listening to poetry read is really about the encounter more so than the sense making. How does it make you feel? How does it make, what ideas does it bring to mind for you? Does it excite you? Does it make you sad? What can you do with it? What can you do with the sensational experience of it? So I think we don't have to read toward meaning. We don't have to read toward meaning making. We can also read for an aesthetic experience that takes us out of ourselves and what we can make for ourselves.
Okay. Uh, Thank you, Dr. Christie. And then there is another question from Rida Tia. Rida, hello, Rida. Would you like to ask directly to Dr. Christie, to Dr. Maxwell?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Okay.
please do.
Uh, Good evening, Mrs. Maxwell and Ma'am Lerianti. I'm Rida Pia from Universitas Negeri Jakarta. So I have a question that's a little out of topic, but I want to know what is the most common genre or type of poetry that young poets write nowadays, and what could possibly affect those young poets to write that type of poetry? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think in general, there is among the young poets that I encounter, primarily through the university where I teach, I think that there's often an initial impulse to write one's story, to write about one's experiences in the world. So there's a strong autobiographical impulse, I think, and one that's often um, perhaps um, less interested in the concrete world than in a world of abstraction, a world of um, feeling and thinking. So, not necessarily poems that are highly populated with images, but more that are um, fueled by emotion or an emotive expression.
Hmm, okay. Well, you mentioned about the what is that? That they tend to what is that? To love writing about their own, right? I mean their life. But then you choose to what is that? To express the climate change. Why is that, Dr. Maxwell?
Well, I think I think we all kind of come up with strategies to deal
Mm,
with what is what our obsessions are, especially when those obsessions are cause anxiety, right? And for me, thinking about the realities of climate change and those feelings of climate despair, that question um, of futurity, it just helps me to use poems to negotiate the anxiety of my own climate despair. So it's like how can I do the work of writing poetry without the constant kind of self-questioning of
mm,
how am I spending my time justifiably doing this thing I love? And the love should be enough, you know. We should be able to do the things we love, but sometimes it helps to find a problem to tackle inside of that that allows for kind of a deeper justification of one's own practice, but also that helps one have a renewed relationship to one's practice, that you're going to it for a different reason than to know something about yourself. You're going to it to try to figure out something about the world.
mm. Okay, interesting. And then we have a question from Instagram. Do you think in order to create poetry, we have to have a degree in literature?
Definitely not. I hope that everyone, when we get off of this webinar today, will just spend 5 minutes just writing, just looking around you and describing the light or drinking something and describing the feel of it in your mouth. Just spend 5 minutes. You know, anyone can write. It's just a matter of taking the time to do it. So I encourage us all to take that time, not only today, but make it a daily practice and see what that does for you. So, yes, anyone, everyone, speak it, write it.
But then for some of us, well, for me, writing is difficult. Finding the muse is it's difficult.
Mhm.
And then the question from Twitter: what are the differences between a poem, poetry reading, with spoken word?
I don't know that there's necessarily always differences. Um, Oftentimes, when we think about a spoken word poem, it's a poem that might not have a life on a page because it's something that might not be written down, or if it's written down, it's only shared through being um, voiced. So sometimes there's that difference, but that's not even always the case. Um, the page poem or poetry that's written down um, should always be also read aloud because poetry is an oral art form. The soundscapes of it are relevant to to its to its form. But the benefit of perhaps of a poem that's also written down is that you get to use the element of the page, the visual element of the page. So you kind of get to widen your toolkit in that way because you can really signify a lot by how you use the page. Is it a kind of an open field where you're putting in lots of spacing? Is it a poem where your line breaks are being used to create two meanings simultaneously? So I think we all from not only speaking our poems but also writing our poems down.
Hmm. Okay. And then for the novice reader, Christy, what are the things that we have to pay attention when reading poem?
I think paying attention to word choice, to phrases that really grab your attention, that make you feel or think something, um, that's a great place to start. And just kind of
Mm-hmm.
annotating as you read, you know, circling or putting an asterisk somewhere, or charting a recurring image throughout a poem can really help you start understanding what the poem's concerns are, you know. So I think physically engaging with a poem can be a great way. Just what moments in the poem are creating those kind of um, latches for you. Where do you feel like you're getting kind of dropped into the poem? Like if someone were to drop you a pin of their location, where are you getting those kind of pin drops in the poem itself?
Mm, okay. So, going back to Petrosino's poems about, you mentioned about the DNA, right? That the sounds similar to DNA. How do you come up with that kind of idea? Well, I don't know. Is it
Well, I
really?
think
Mm-hmm.
when thinking about the sestina,
Mm-hmm.
one of my favorite sestinas is Elizabeth Bishop's
Okay.
Sestina, which is a poem that's also thinking about inheritance. Um, the poet lost her uh, parents at a very young age and moved to live with her grandparents. And that sestina is so interesting because traditionally a sestina is using iambic pentameter, but she uses in that poem tetrameter. So there's already a sense of something that's missing, that something's not quite there. And then to work through the braiding of that, the patterning of the sestina just really draws out that question of legacy, of lineage, and those kinds of things. So I think that's kind of where I'm kind of rooting my thinking about that sestina in terms of it being a good form for thinking through inheritance because of that braided patterning that does recall that helix shape.
Okay. All right. Thank you. This is Tina then. It's a question from Atorantula. She or he asked the question, with social media, we have a lot of mediums to deliver our poetry, from Instagram posts, short from on Twitter, and many more. How do you see this coming future with this development?
I think it's great to be able to share your work in any ways you want, and the taking the burden off of sending work out in order for it to be circulated can be a really liberating experience for a writer who wants to circulate their work widely. So I think those platforms allow for that, allow for a lot of self-claiming of agency and control over one's writing and the circulation of it. I am not on Twitter, so I can't really speak to the life of poetry on that social media platform. But it certainly seems from what I hear that it's a lively space for the debate of debates of poetry and the circulation of poems. So I say if you're committed to getting your poem out there and out there quickly and moving among readers that you develop through those platforms, then great for you.
Okay. And then another question from at Dia Hanitab on Instagram. What is your favorite poems or poems? Not poems.
Mm. One of the first poets that I kind of ever deeply experienced was Gerard Manley Hopkins. When I was a small girl, um, I just had some issues with speaking, with articulating words, and so was with a speech therapist for a number of years. And
Mm,
she would have me repeat Gerard Manley Hopkins lines, and it's
mm,
because they're so mouth dense. They're so good for learning how to wrap your mouth around different sounds. So in some ways, I feel like my first words were a poet's words and not mine. So I definitely have a a spiritual, deep relationship with Hopkins. I love the writing of Harriet Mullen, a contemporary U.S. writer, just for um, its dynamism. It's some of the most dynamic reading that I ever, or writing that I ever get to read. It kind of requires us to hold simultaneously so many competing threads. So it's a very exciting, she's very exciting to read. And I'm always drawn to the long lyric narrative sequences of Anne Carson. Autobiography of Red is a great place to start if you're looking for a book length sequence.
Okay, so poetry really does help. Okay. And then, uh, uh, Christy, it's about we as teacher. So, what are the things that we have to, what is that, bear in mind when teaching poetry?
One of the things I have to bear in mind with teaching poetry is that a lot of people have misconceptions about it as
Mm.
something that is um, scary and hard. And so
You're right.
just overcoming that misconception, I think, is always the first step. Um,
But
helping
how?
people helping people find joy in it. Well,
Mm.
I think through a lot of um, I think it can be done through kind of focusing on one poem or a couple of poems at a time, reading through them together, showing how we can arrive at different readings of the poem, and no one is right or wrong necessarily. It's just our readings can be kind of a chorus of possibilities that so we're kind of adding to the song. Um, I think using poetry can be a really great strategy for helping people um, feel like they don't have to wait for, say, the muse to come sit with them. They can just start writing. So writing into
Mm.
things, kind of making the idea of composing less intimidating. Um,
Mm.
that a poem can be written using the newspaper, cut it up,
Mm.
draw the words out, rearrange them, what kinds of phrases emerge from that. So our poems can come from the language, the words we encounter every day. They don't have to be gauzy or overwrought or the 9 syllable words, right? They can be poetry can also be a site for the language we're deeply familiar with already.
Mhm. But then writing poems in English is an extra work for us,
Oh,
speaker of for us. English is a foreign language for us, so it's actually a challenge.
oh yeah,
Actually,
I would say
uh-huh.
so. I can't write a poem in your language. So I hats off to anyone who can write or speak or even form a sentence in multiple languages. I wouldn't um, beat yourself up about the quality of the English writing. I think it has to do more with just the consistency of the practice, right?
Okay.
Even if it's
Consistency.
just one sentence a day, even if it's just
Mm.
5 lines a day, just
Mhm.
setting up challenges that are things you can actually accomplish. It doesn't
Mhm.
have to be, the epic poem in a week.
No,
It can
okay.
also just be the line. I think it can be really just exciting to try to come up with a phrase that excites
Mhm.
you, you know?
Okay.
Like,
Yep, yep, yep. You're
um,
right. So
yeah.
be consistent, and then don't
Mm-hmm.
afraid to start writing, and then
Mm-hmm.
just anything on your hats, and then just what is that? Put it there on the paper, for instance, and so on and so forth. And there is a question from at LX Forever on Instagram. Christy, do you see a rise interest in poetry due to Amanda Gorman performance at the inauguration?
Mm. It's perhaps too early for me to speak to that because our enrollment had already happened. for the spring semester before she read her poem. It'll be interesting to see if we see any difference in enrollment in the fall semester in poetry classes. So I'll report back to you on the Instagram thread at some point and let you know. I sure hope so. I hope there's a huge, huge rise in excitement around poetry among our young people.
Okay. And then a question from at OMG, she speak on Instagram. Is collaborating between two authors possible for creating a poem, not a poet? How about cross country poetry? Okay.
Oh, definitely, definitely. Collaborative poetry is alive and kicking. You know, it's often the case that poets who used to live in a city together and move away from one another use correspondence correspondence poetry as a way to maintain touch. And it's if you think about it, we can think about it kind of like a correspondence chess game, and the kind
Mm-hmm.
of the surrealist strategy of the exquisite corpse, where just lines are being mailed back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, where you're
Mm-hmm.
just adding one line. So again, not setting the bar too high to make it something you can accomplish, but just setting out something that's going to keep it consistent and keep it something that can easily circulate back and forth. So that can be a great way to write. It also helps us get out of the limitations of our own word banks and experiences to have to brush up against someone else's words and
Mm-hmm.
images and
Mm-hmm.
experiences and sounds, because we all gravitate toward different things. I love collaborative writing. Do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. It's challenge, but it's very challenging. There is a question from Julia Thea. Julia, would you like to ask Dr. Kristi Maxwell directly? Julia.
Yes, um, thank you. Um, Good evening, Dr. Maxwell and Ma'am Lelianti. I'm Julia from UNJ. I would love to know Dr. Maxwell's personal thought about the works of Robert Frost in general, and how do we suppose to look at or respond to other work of poetry or poem from the point of view?
Hmm.
Is it possible? I mean, the sense of how do we have a thought on the other works or a kind of sensing. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia.
I'm excited that you're reading Frost. I don't know that I have strong feelings about Frost. He's not necessarily one of my personal touchstones, so I don't know that I feel entirely prepared to answer that question, to be honest with you. Um, so I'm sorry. I might have to kind of uh, to, it's something I would have to think about
Okay.
longer.
All right. Okay. So we're going to move on to question from at mommy dot the line on Instagram. What inspire you to write a poetry, a poem?
You know, it can be anything. One of the interesting things, I love that this question is coming from Instagram, because I've been
Mm-hmm.
doing a series of writing experiments that I call Instagram ekphrastics.
Mm.
Ekphrasis is just the translation of visual um, art into verbal art, right? So I
Mm.
use, maybe to justify the time I spend on Instagram, I've begun this writing practice around it, where I look at an image and then I try to write two or three lines translating that image into to words, and then going to the next. And the strange juxtapositions that happen that we're really used to on Instagram, where we're not controlling the content. So a dog can be followed by a picture of art at the border wall, for instance. That strange juxtaposition then can manifest in the writing itself as it unfolds, moving from image to image to image to image. Um, I think you can kind of use anything ahead of you.
Hmm. Okay, but it is possible to have Instagram class. I mean, writing a poetry class in Instagram on Instagram. Yes, is it?
Sure, do it.
Okay.
I mean, I've never
All
done it,
right.
but but I support trying it. Sure.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Christie, for the insights and the responses. And then so, ladies and gentlemen, and my dear students, um, what is that? The last question, and Dr. Maxwell respond marks the end of the webinar. Thank you so much once again, Dr. Christie. You have taken us to this engaging, short learning journey to touch and feel the beauty of American poetry. Thank you so much to all participants and the committee. See you guys once again in another at America webinar. I'm going to give the screen back to James. James.
Right. Thank you so much, Ibu Eva and Dr. Christie, for such an informative session. Earlier in the event, we asked our audience members a question. Which poem was recited by Amanda Gorman during the inauguration of President Joe Biden? The correct answer to that is option A, The Hill We Climb. Congratulations goes to Adi Nugroho from Facebook for answering correctly. Thank you to everyone who has participated. Don't forget to tune in next time to get another chance for a shout out from us. I'd also like to remind all our audience members of our giveaways, the 5 bicycles for our 5 lucky people. And if you're still interested in joining, visit our link at bit.ly/payitforward for more information. Now, you may be wondering, how could I develop an awesome idea for a place like this? It's actually very easy. All you need to do is go to our website at www.atamerica.or.id, select Create a Program, and click Collaborate with us. All event proposals coming to us will be reviewed, and your event might be featured here soon. You can also subscribe to our newsletter for all our weekly updates. That wraps this episode. It's been fun, but we have to say goodbye for now. Follow our Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at @ATAmerica for all our fun contents, event updates, and so much more. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. My name is James, and I'll see you at the next At America TV episode. Goodbye.